Stay tuned after the episode to hear our latest edition of And Then What?
I got a phone call. My district ranger at the Darrington district, he called me a few days before the actual termination order came through, just to say, like, hey, I'm sure you've been reading the news. There's a lot of information in the news about these probationary employees being fired. And I was in that probationary period. It's a year from your hire date, a year of working time from your hire date. So it wouldn't have been until later this summer that I would have been out of my probationary period. So he called me a few days before the termination actually happened and said, we don't know anything yet, really. Yes, this information's in the news, but I'm not hearing anything coming down from people above me, from the chain of command. So I just want to say, we hope you can come back. I don't know if this is going to happen, but it might. And then a couple days later, on the 14th, he called to say that I had been terminated. I was pretty stunned at first, just shocked that it was happening at all. So it was shocking to see the stability of a federal job vanish in like a second.
This is Sam Webster.
And Sam, as you guessed, was one of thousands of Forest Service, National Parks, and Bureau of Land Management employees who got caught up in what has come to be known as the Valentine's Day Massacre, where, as part of sweeping DOGE cuts, or Department of Government Efficiency, tens of thousands of federal employees were fired.
In part because we know some of those impacted. Some of them were people who listen to the show. You've even heard stories from some of them on this show. So the numbers in those headlines felt less like numbers on a spreadsheet to us and more like people. People with jobs and livelihoods that they loved who are now swept up in the strange whims of a billionaire wielding a literal chainsaw.
So we started talking with people. Most of them couldn't talk on the record because they feared retribution, or they hoped they would be hired back because they were fired but then rehired and then put on furlough. Honestly, it can get pretty confusing.
And one thing was super clear. Even while they were all facing hardship, they were all trapped in the middle of this very strange moment in history, they were thinking beyond themselves. There was this deep worry, the very thing that drew them into the work, about public lands, waters, forests, rivers, deserts, oceans. They felt that they were at risk, that this was bigger than their job or any one person.
The majority of public lands, which is 640 million acres, are held in trust for you and me and all Americans by a number of federal agencies. It is a deeply complicated endeavor that balances timber, mining, alternative energies with conservation, recreation, and tribal treaty rights, just to name a few interests. Holding it all together requires not just tens of thousands of federal workers, but deep collaborations with non-for-profits, and not to mention countless hours of volunteer labor from everyday people. It's far from perfect and certainly could be improved upon, but it's the system that has held up public lands, and it has worked, for better or for worse, for generations.
So today we bring you the Ranger, Sam Webster, a second-generation public steward, a person for whom public lands has been interwoven with life from the earliest age when Sam followed his parents through their careers in the Park Service. When it became time to chart his course through a career, he followed a similar path into public service.
We go past the headlines and ask a deeper question. What happens when the foundation you've built a life upon begins to crumble? I'm Andrew Burton.
I'm Fitz Cahall, and you're listening to the Dirtbag Diaries.
Grew up in Arches National Park.
Here's Sam.
Actually, I was born at Crater Lake. My parents worked there when I was first born, but then when I was less than a year old, we moved to Arches, where my dad took the job as the chief ranger there, which meant he was had required occupancy, so he had to live in the park. So we lived in park housing pretty much until I was started high school. I'm 14, and it's probably easy to say that that's where my love of being outside began because I spent most of my time playing outside, and both my parents spent their whole careers for the Park Service. My mom worked into interpretation for a long time. She eventually became the museum curator for the Southeast Utah groups of parks, which is Arches, Canyonlands, Hovenweep, and Natural Bridges. My parents were then, still are, really avid hikers, so they took my sister and I on hikes all throughout the park to lots of far-flung places.
Sam went to college in Salt Lake City for environmental studies, where he continued to lean into his love of being outside.
Probably my most favorite way to spend time outside is backpacking alone. That's been the case for a long time. Getting to go at my own pace, too. Like, I'm not a person who's particularly drawn to achieving huge objectives outside or, trying to improve some kind of time or anything like that. I just love to slow down, be outside, and go with the flow of what's happening around me in nature.
As Sam finished college, he set his sights on trying to find a job which could keep him outdoors using the skill sets he'd learned as an environmental studies major.
I applied for probably 40 some odd jobs with the Park Service for a summer seasonal job to national park sites all over the country. And the one that I happened to get for that first summer out of college was in Sequoia National Park. And I worked there as what they call a trailhead ranger. So half the time I was in a visitor center. For a few days, I'd write backcountry permits for people coming in. And then the other half the time, I would do backcountry patrols.
After a few years working in the front country offices and patrolling nearby trails, Sam got a coveted promotion of sorts to backcountry wilderness ranger. It's a rare job in which he lived in the backcountry of Sequoia Kings National Park.
It really wasn't my intention to follow in my parents' footsteps at all. I'm glad that I did. I'm glad I spent many years working in Sequoia and Kings Canyon, but it was certainly not a big goal of mine to have a government career in the way they did until I landed in the wilderness ranger job there. And that's such a unique position that it kind of drew me away from the idea of a career at all. It's really only, as far as I know, Sequoia and Kings Canyon is really the only park in the whole National Park Service system that has rangers who are living in the field in a remote location alone for a whole summer season. And they only have about, when they're at peak staffing, maybe 13 of those people in the whole park. And a lot of them, like when I first came and had my very first season there in Sequoia as just a trailhead ranger, writing permits part of the time, a lot of the people who worked there as wilderness rangers had been there for around 40 years. So even though it was just a summer seasonal job and they were the exact same pay grade and pay scale as I was, showing up at 22 and they were in their 70s, they had loved that job so much that they decided to build their whole life around it.
There's a version of this story where that's who Sam becomes. He would have stayed at Sequoia Kings, living in the backcountry during the summers as a seasonal ranger, finding odd jobs and other seasonal work in the winter, and keeping at it late into life. Instead, his life took a turn. He followed his heart up to Washington State, where he had reconnected with a high school sweetheart, but he wasn't sure if the skills he had honed after 10 years at the national parks would translate to any jobs in the Pacific Northwest.
This job with the Forest Service kind of appeared and seemed like a great fit and like a very surprising one that I could somehow do wilderness ranger work but still live in a metro area where my partner could find good work. They had this big hiring push that year in 2023, I think it was. They wanted to harness people like me who had been seasonals, even though I just worked for the Park Service. The Forest Service functions very similarly, where they have lots of seasonal employees who come on for the busy summer season, and then you're fired at the end of the season. But the Forest Service wanted to take those seasonals who had been coming back year after year after year and harness their institutional knowledge and turn them into permanent employees. So they had this big hiring push where they hired lots of what they call permanent seasonals, where you still work seasonally. Your season is still covers the busy season, and then you get furloughed for a few months in the wintertime when there's not nearly as much visitation and not as much work to get done for those few months. But you're still considered a permanent employee. You still get benefits through the whole year and all that. You can expect to come back the next summer every time around. So I applied for it and was lucky enough to be hired.
So, Andrew, Sam is a wilderness ranger, but it's worth noting how broad this type of permanent seasonal employee is in the Forest Service. Seasonal employees, it could be a hotshot, an avalanche forecaster. It could be a maintenance worker, volunteer coordinators, scientists. It's people that are needed every single year, but they're not needed the entire year. So like they might work 9 months out of the year. The list goes on.
In the spring of 2024, Sam started his new job as wilderness ranger for the Forest Service in the Darrington Ranger District, about 75 miles from Seattle.
And it's kind of an amazing place. Like, I have a soft spot for Darrington. I think that zone is definitely on the top 10 lists for areas you most likely encounter Bigfoot. And I think it's sort of been overlooked in terms of recreation and visitation. But that started to change in the last 15 years.
Driving into Darrington, it kind of feels like almost like you're driving into the Alps. It's really wild. There's just some huge, really spectacular mountains that just erupt out of the valley floor right there. You can see glaciers from the town. Like, it's pretty incredible. As you get further out into the district, you can easily get kind of above the tree line into some high alpine environments. Glacier Peak is there, which is, I think, maybe the most remote of the Cascade volcanoes. It takes a day or two probably just to get there. Lots of people climb it and ski it. And part of the PCT goes through a big chunk of the Darrington district. That's another kind of big highway that travels a lot of people through there. It's super remote, and it seems to get hit really hard with some pretty insane weather. So they've had a lot of major washouts for many years, huge sections of trails that have just completely blown out, and they haven't been able to repair or maintain because they haven't had the personnel or the funding to do so. But the country itself is really, really amazing, not just these high alpine environments and volcanoes and glaciers, but also really lush forests along the river bottoms, and things growing everywhere. For somebody who grew up in the desert, it was unreal to walk around somewhere that just has things growing out of things that are growing out of things. And it's amazing. It's so lush there. Darrington Ranger District of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie Forest had hired myself and another person to kind of basically help them restart their wilderness ranger program. They hadn't had any wilderness rangers on their district since the 1990s. So it had been many, many decades since they'd had any kind of agency personnel who were specifically addressing how the public used the 3 wilderness areas that are in or overlap with the Darrington Ranger District. So our job was to both be the first couple wilderness rangers and do a lot of the basic on the ground work of trail patrols, picking up trash, learning more about how people are disposing of their waste and trying to come up with plans to manage that better, and speaking to people, just giving them information, getting information from them, since they hadn't been talking to people for 30 years who'd been recreating out there. It was also a big part of our job to, like, whoever we bumped into, ask them what's going on, how do they use this place, how have they always used this place, what works, what doesn't for them. That was a big part of our job, but the other part was to also build this program. So we were also trying to create some systems that could be in place for eventually more rangers to be brought on board. The idea was that we would begin to supervise some seasonals. We would send them out on some regular patrols to do that same kind of on-the-ground field work and gather a lot more useful information, learn how to better manage some of these particular areas. And it's also hugely beneficial to the agency because they get a lot of information about why people are going where they're going, when, for how long, tons of information like that that they just hadn't been able to collect for decades. And so my coworker and I were both that was a huge draw for us, was that we both got to be doing some incredible field work in a beautiful place, but also building something that could last in that district that hadn't been around for a long time.
And did you have a favorite part about that job?
A couple of really awesome patrols, and I got to like get a good sense of really just how remote the Darrington district is, which is really shocking given how close it is to Seattle and the greater Seattle metro area, that within a couple of hours that you could be in a place that feels very much like no one's been around for weeks. It's interesting just to explore, and like to bring it back to kind of what I was saying earlier, just to have some time outside by myself at my own pace is always a good thing. And it was really nice to find that here, but it wasn't super common for me during a weekday to run into very many people. So I was kind of struck by the solitude there, which is an important part of the Wilderness Act. How we've chosen to define wilderness is that opportunity for solitude.
So the Darrington Ranger District encompasses 540,000 acres. But if you live outside of Washington State, there's a good chance you've never heard of places like White Horse Mountain, the Big Four Ice Caves, or Glacier Peak. So to put this in context, the entirety of Yosemite National Park is about 750,000 acres. So the Darrington Ranger District, it's not small, it's not enormous, but it's certainly not small.
It's probably worth taking a moment to zoom out a bit. Sam works at the Forest Service Ranger District that has 540,000 acres. It's part of the Great Pacific Northwest Region 6, which has 24 million acres in it. That region is one of 9 regions in the Forest Service, which all told manages 193 million acres of public land.
Alongside the Forest Service, there's the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And all told, they manage 640 million acres, which is roughly 28% of the U.S. landmass.
And those 4 agencies employ 73,000 workers. Roughly, that equates for 1 employee for about every 10,000 acres, give or take.
In all these lands, they're managed for a variety of purposes, from timber to oil and gas to grazing, recreation, wildlife to wilderness protection. No matter what purpose the land is managed for, there is a guiding principle. If you manage simply for the moment, if you think about things just in the next few years, that's a resource that will not be there for the future. To keep it in public trust means thinking about our kids' generation and the generations beyond that.
And that also means that institutions like that often move or evolve slowly. Their employees approach things on a decades-long scale versus pivoting on a dime.
Big ships aren't good at turning quickly, by nature. We argue and debate all the time about what we should be doing with these lands, how to manage them, etc. There are a lot of opinions, but there is just one set of public lands.
It seemed like a unicorn to get this job, to do the wilderness work. And I was still have still been living in the Seattle area this whole time and commuting up there. And I was like, well, maybe I can kind of have it both ways. And I can do a lot of the field work that I love to do, but also have some of this permanent stability that is hugely important. And that, you know, my parents spent their whole careers in the Park Service. My fiance's parents also spent their whole careers in the Park Service. So we both grew up learning like the permanent government job is the ticket to stable middle-class life. So it felt very much like, wow, you know, but I've kind of arrived in that way, that I've like unlocked this door to an actual career in a way that I'd never really thought I would be able to before.
After 10 years, Sam's role felt like both a present and a future.
So, Andrew, I have a question. Like, Sam mentioned that the Darrington Ranger District hadn't had a backcountry ranger for nearly 30 years. I think I first started visiting that area 25 years ago, and I remember it being like pretty rugged and overgrown, and you go up a road and there'd be like a million down trees when you're trying to get to a climb. But some of the work was still getting done. How was that happening?
Yeah, one of the things I hadn't thought much about before reporting on this story was this interplay between the Forest Service and other organizations. So for the Forest Service, they often partner with the nonprofit sector. In Washington state, for instance, there are many organizations that help with the upkeep. One of the biggest is the Washington Trails Association. They've been around for more than 60 years and advocate for public lands, organize and run volunteer crews for trail maintenance, and have a youth engagement program. Many people might know them for their website and app, where people can read about the conditions of specific trails in a real up-to-date way. They get close to 6 million visits every year, and people hiking in Washington state have logged almost 275,000 trip reports. We talked to Jen Gradisher, the trail program director.
We are the largest state-based trail maintenance volunteer organization in the country, and so that definitely translates here locally in Washington as well. Our trail maintenance program was founded back in 1993, and it was founded on the basis of helping to support gaps that we were seeing on public lands statewide, and most specifically on the gaps we were seeing at the time with the federal workforce. Our trail maintenance program on an annual average basis puts out 160,000 hours across public lands on trails. About 43% of that is on federal land trails specifically, and that is an average of 300 trails annually and about 3,500 volunteers that help to participate. Our three tenets of our trail maintenance program is safety, fun, and work, and that order can vary depending on if we're working with staff primarily or if we're working with volunteers. And so when we're on the volunteer side, in addition to just creating a great volunteer experience and a connection to the land and, becoming familiar with how to maintain trails, it's in addition to the volunteer experience of that day, it's being able to just get a little bit of work done on trail where we can.
Jen explained how federal agencies like the Forest Service interface with the WTA.
We meet annually to address priorities that the Forest Service has for the work that they would like to see us help support. And also we provide priorities from our community as well. So through things like our trip reports that we receive from our community and reports of how trail conditions are looking out there, we tend to bring those to the table to see what we might be able to help accomplish. Of course, all of the work that WTA does with the Forest Service is under an agreement and contracts that we have with the agency. And that is also where we are able to generate revenue to help make the work happen out on trail.
And like so many things in this world, those relationships have gotten a lot more formalized through the years. I feel like in my grandfather's era, they would have just been dragging Boy Scouts out there to earn hard labor badges and chainsaw merit badges with very little supervision. I imagine that there's probably been some insurance companies and lawsuits that made everyone get a little bit more buttoned up in terms of these relationships.
Yeah, it has all gotten more complicated, but also probably more effective. It's a win-win scenario. As the summer of 2024 wore on, Sam continued to grow in his new position with the Forest Service. When not in the backcountry patrolling, he and his colleagues worked on grants, like one that was run through the state of Washington that would award more than $200,000 for more backcountry rangers in their district. In the background of this, though, was the impending 2024 presidential election.
Leading up to the election was not a huge part of the puzzle. It was not a big topic of discussion, in the office. Didn't seem to me like it was forefront of anyone's minds that there could be some big administration change, because people who work for the federal government have, and especially if they've been doing that their whole careers, they've lived through tons of administration changes. It's super normal. And yes, that can come with some big picture changes in how an agency might address particular issues. But usually the shift in administration for people who are as on the ground as I have been in my career is pretty subtle, if not totally negligible. In my experience as a seasonal ranger, going through probably 3 or 4 administration changes, it had zero bearing on my job, but never changed anything for it. So the lead up to it, I would say it was not really a huge concern. And if anything, there was a lot of optimism around, I think, not because there was an impending election, but because there had been some big changes in the Forest Service very recently. So like one was that big hiring push that I mentioned. They hired several thousand permanent seasonals across the country. It came with a lot of like, awesome, we might be able to get some things done because the Forest Service has long been hurting for money. The moment that I was hired was a moment where they were like, oh my God, maybe we can actually do some stuff. And like, we'll have more than a trail crew and we'll be able to, get to these places on district that we've been wanting to go work on for over a decade. That was more the vibe in my experience around the office, is that was happening. And then that maybe shifted a little bit as we got towards the end of the summer, not because of the impending election, but because some news came down that the Forest Service was actually in a huge amount of debt and that they had kind of racked up a pretty high bill that they were not able to meet. And that was forcing some bigger changes in hiring. They decided to not hire any seasonal employees for the coming season. Like, that is a huge, huge loss for the Forest Service because most of the on the ground work that happens, if you ever do see a Forest Service person in the field, they're probably a seasonal employee. Not being able to hire those people who make up a bulk of the field going positions that get a lot of on the ground work done, that was a huge change already and was starting to put the brakes on a lot of the optimism that had been around when I first showed up. So post-election, that continued. It was clear that, some changes would happen. And at that point, kind of early in November, nothing was as clear as it would become about what those changes would look like. But there was certainly introduced into the work environment some element of fear that like there had just been a big change of this big hiring push, lots of optimism. Whoa, pump the brakes. We can't have any seasonals. And then this third new change of like, wow, now what's going to happen? This will be a big shift in the administration. And I think people could sense that it would be a different kind of shift than how those presidential transitions usually went.
Shortly after the election, Sam went on furlough, which was a planned part of his full-time job.
The day before I was furloughed, we closed on our first house, which was super exciting. So a lot of my furlough was actually spent fixing up this new house that we just bought. We did quite a lot of work to it. And the reason we could do it was because I, on paper, had this very stable looking job. That was 100% the reason that we could buy a house to begin with, or be approved for a loan to buy a house to begin with. So very grateful that was the case and we were able to do it. I was pretty much totally checked out of work. I couldn't check my emails or anything like that. We had no access to any kind of government computer or systems. So when those big changes did start to happen with Doge and all these executive orders coming out, I really wasn't around for any of it, which was kind of bizarre.
The Diaries is supported by Oboes. So Oboes set up camp in the legendary hiking and backpacking hub of Bozeman, Montana. There are literally millions of acres of peaks, valleys, rivers, and prairies, and even the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in their backyard. And Oboes basically turned it into a natural R&D lab. The updated Katabatic footwear collection is perfect for fast packing or quick day hikes. It's lighter and built with more environmentally friendly materials, and whether you're crossing creeks or trying to escape a thunderstorm while you're out on the trail, the waterproof style includes Gore-Tex Invisible Fit technology for enhanced breathability. I've been rocking the Katabatic LT out in the woods, and I love the lightness, but also the stability, which is kind of important for me when I'm carrying a pack. It makes me feel like I'm moving quickly on the trail. To find your next pair of footwear, check out obosfootwear.com/lovehiking. Oboes Footwear. Love hiking. Support for the Diaries comes from our good friends at Kuat Racks. Are you looking to level up your truck bed setup for the summer season? The Ibex from Kuat Racks is the perfect companion. This fully modular, all-metal bed rack system is built to handle every season and sport. So whether you're hauling bikes, kayaks, rooftop tents, or just gearing up for the summer road trip, the Ibex adapts with adjustable height options and a growing lineup of accessories. And now, new for 2025, the Ibex Panel Kit. It's designed to partially or fully enclose the ibex. The panel kit keeps your gear secure and dry from the elements, and the lockable gull-wing doors offer a quick, easy access to the truck bed when you need it. Currently available for 2016 to 2025 Toyota Tacoma short beds, with more fitments on the way. Find out more at kuat.com. So we just got back from hanging out on the beach in California, and it was like classic Northern California beach weather where it was a mix of fog, sun, and wind. And though we were really good at putting sunscreen on in the morning, sometimes we slipped in the afternoon, and it was like, why would I ever get burned? It's gray out. And then we got torched. Fortunately, we had Tern's Mayday, designed for when you've been exposed to the element. It has 3-time Tern's special marine-derived complex that speeds up skin regeneration and healing, and it helps minimize peeling and replenishes moisture. I like Tern's philosophy of maximum results, minimum routine. Having a go-to product that's good for my skin is awesome. After sun should not be an afterthought, especially at this time of year when we're all out doing the things we love and sometimes getting burned. Use the code DIRTBAG to get 25% off your first order at terns.com. We'll put a link in the show notes, and you can try Terns for yourself.
And then in February, just weeks before he was supposed to return to work,
I got a phone call. My district ranger at the Darrington district, he called to say that I had been terminated. I was pretty stunned at first. Like almost speechless, and yeah, that is probably the emotion that stuck with me the longest. Is that I was just like, I can't believe it. This is totally unreal. I never in a million years thought that this would be a thing that would happen, let alone a thing that would happen to me. And inside of that, part of that was also like kind of disbelief. I was kind of like, there's no way that this can stick. I mean, this has long been the case with Trump, both in his first term and this term. A lot of things he tries to do, eventually they get overturned by something. And so I was like, okay, yes, this is crazy and it's happening to me, but there's no way that this is actually going to stick. I felt I was overwhelmed and shocked by it, but as also a big part of me was like, well, but he probably can't do this. But I still had to ride that ride. I spent a lot of time receiving a lot of emails and sending a lot of emails and filling out a lot of paperwork, both just to be terminated. I had to fill out quite a bit of paperwork, and also communicating with our union rep and answering questions from them to kind of be a part of whatever kind of mass action or lawsuit they were going to take. So I submitted lots of paperwork and documents for that, and really just kind of waited to see what would happen. Really, most of my information in that time frame all came from reading the news. But like, very rarely did my immediate supervisors, have really any more information. They were just as in the dark as me. And any time that I would call and ask some question or some kind of update, they would say, "We're not really sure. We're not hearing anything from our chain of command. We don't know what's going to happen, if this will get overturned or not." But they were clear that right off the bat, when I was terminated, that, it was not at all their doing, that my immediate supervisors had no part of that and certainly did not want to terminate me at all. And I mean, my district ranger said that it was the worst day of his federal career when he had to call all of these employees that he just hired and tell them that they were terminated.
Were there lawsuits? Like, what happened with the courts?
Yes, there were several lawsuits led by labor unions and nonprofit groups. They were filed against the federal government, challenging the legality of the terminations, which occurred across many federal agencies beyond the Forest Service. On March 5th, a 45-day stay of terminations was issued, meaning the probationary employees had to be able to return to work with back pay.
And eventually those terminations were rescinded, and they were, which ultimately meant that like the action, the official human resources action to terminate me was never even actually submitted and processed. I was able to come back on about 2 weeks later than I had been anticipating, like to return from my furlough. So I came back in mid-March instead of the beginning of March, and went back to the office right after that.
So Sam kind of entered back into work as the courts were putting these stays into effect.
Yeah, that's correct.
And it was all temporary at that stage, right?
Yes, but it's clear that there is an onslaught beyond just what's happened to Sam. For instance, the Trump administration started taking a hacksaw to public lands via executive order. Headlines have come out, including Trump wanting the Forest Service to increase logging by 25%. And he declared a national energy emergency that has accelerated domestic energy production and critical mineral mining while decreasing public input. The administration rescinded the roadless rule, which is almost 30 years old and was put in place in large part because the U.S. government couldn't afford to subsidize logging roads for timber companies anymore. Then Congress, under pressure from the administration, got into it. They used the budget reconciliation process to try and wedge a bunch of terrible stuff together. Public land sell-offs and weakening environmental reviews, allowing companies to essentially pay to be able to avoid environmental reviews, opening the Arctic to further drilling, and increasing timber harvests. After the judges weighed in on the firings that happened to people like Sam, the administration went about it in a way that was more legally accessible. They filed reductions in force. Budgets for the National Park Service and the Forest Service are being slashed, and a reduction in force is coming through with more layoffs, and many government employees are being offered buyouts to leave the workforce. Park Service employees have been scrambling to cover other employee roles. All these cuts weren't supposed to impact firefighting operations, but as we entered summer, it became clear that the DOGE cuts hit there as well. And when we talk with friends who work in Washington, D.C. and see all of this up close and personal, the scariest part is that the actual institutions are quite rudderless.
It was all just a lot. I feel like it was designed just to completely overwhelm and stress the entire system.
It's chaos on every level. And it's so chaotic that for an organization like the WTA, which is a nonprofit, it's now all of a sudden difficult for them to do their part. Here's Jen again.
With the impacts that are happening at the federal level with the budgets on the National Park Service side and on the Forest Service side, that is leading to a reduction in the funding that and altogether stopping in a lot of ways the funding that we receive to do our trail work on federal lands. And so WTA is not able to do as much on federal lands as we typically would on an annual basis because of this lack of funding. And in addition to that, we're also unable to coordinate with key Forest Service staff that we would typically work with annually at the district and forest levels who have either lost their jobs or are at risk of losing them in future cuts. There's endless amount of maintenance, both in the front country and back country, that is needed, and especially with the reduction in Forest Service staffing, that demand is a lot higher on partners like WTA. And so the communication and the coordination is unable to happen without the key staff at the federal level to help our crews get out in the field. And so despite the need, just the lack of staffing and resources altogether are preventing us from being able to do the level of work that we typically would or that the Forest Service would like us to be able to do. As agreements have continued to be paused or frozen, that has caused the dialogue to pause and freeze because of the ability to execute any of the planned work that folks have.
Beyond the newfound lack of communication from government partners, we asked Jen if she could speak about the specific amounts of funding that the WTA is now losing out on from the Forest Service and others.
So thinking about 40% of the trail maintenance budget, so 40% of $2 million is at risk. And as I mentioned, that directly impacts our ability to get folks out on trail. To speak a little more, there's no shortage of interest from volunteers to help. And it's really about our ability to mobilize and to put the resources forward to be able to do that. And so we've been able to use support from donors to some degree to help get some of that 40% back, but there's still a huge deficit that we're looking at. And that's why we've had to scale back our programs in general this year to be able to speak to the work that is out on the landscape. We typically each year will have a staff crew leader who is based on the Darrington Ranger District. And with the reduction in resources we have received from the Forest Service, we were unable to hire for that position this year. And so we are still able to put out a small number of day work parties and multi-day trips on the district, but there will be drastic cuts in our offerings of what we're able to provide out there.
Jen has worked on the Darrington district, both with Sam and other backcountry rangers, and I wanted to know what effects she was seeing for this summer out there.
At this point in time, it's really looking at what are the top priorities with the resources that are available and where are the highest need areas to direct those resources to. So specifically, there will continue to be a lot of deferred maintenance in the backcountry and places that may be impacted by fires and things of that nature that could use some opening up. So a lot of the effort will be redirected towards the front country landscape, the high use trails that are still going to see a lot of the population that we typically see on an annual basis using those trails. And without the lack of Forest Service support to be able to help keep those trails in good condition, we'll have to redirect and have been redirecting a lot of our efforts to the front country to help assist those high priority areas. And so that may also look like some of the high priority trails in the front country could get more focus than others, just simply because of the way that the public is flocking to certain areas.
Though funding and staffing at federal land agencies has changed, it doesn't correlate with the public's interests in getting outside. That has only continued to rise in recent years. And for the employees that remain, there's a new level of uncertainty. Let's head back to Sam again, who had just survived his, I guess we'll call it a fake firing.
On my first day back in the office, we had a long meeting in the morning about kind of like, here's what the season might look like, given the lack of seasonals that we already knew we couldn't hire, plus these people who had been terminated and not yet brought back on yet. And then right after that came this second deferred resignation offer, which the first time around was called the Fork in the Road email, which was offering employees to basically take a buyout, and you could resign, stop going to work, but you would get, the offer was that you would get paid through the end of the fiscal year, at the end of September, but you wouldn't have to go to work. And that offer came in that very first day that I went back to the office. You had a week to decide if you wanted to accept it or not. And I ultimately chose to accept that resignation offer. It was a hard choice to come around to, mostly because it felt so unreal. The hardest thing about me accepting that offer was that it was hard for me to believe that that offer was real. And I had to really wrap my head around, are they actually going to pay me to not do my job through the end of September? Because it seemed just so absurd to me. But I felt good about resigning ultimately, because really quickly I had seen in the matter of a few months, the ground had shifted so much under me that I was suddenly looking at a landscape where I could no longer see myself building a career in the Forest Service. But even if I were to not take this deferred resignation offer and continue working on the Darrington district, this coming season was probably not really going to be able to do my job at all. That was more likely that I would end up doing a lot of front country projects, like taking care of campsites right along the highway and the really most heavily impacted parts of the forest, which are the ones that people can access by car the most easily. So I would probably have been doing a lot of trash pickup and maintenance of those campsites because they weren't able to hire any more employees to do that work. And that's the most visible work that there is. So it has to get done so that the public can at least feel like the government's still working in that sense. So I was looking at okay, this summer, I'm probably not going to be able to do my job. Am I going to be able to do it next summer? Probably not. And I was trying to kind of play that tape forward of when am I actually going to be able to start building some more skills here that will help me rise in this organization. And when I took the job, that was what had been offered to me. And we talked about how these big life things have just happened to me in the last year. Engaged, about to get married, we just bought a house. My fiance's dad passed away. We've had some huge, huge life changes in the last year or two. And I ultimately had to consider this offer in that context, that this is the moment in my life that this is happening. And I can't afford to keep working for the Forest Service and just twiddle my thumbs for the next 4 years. But like, I need to be working somewhere that is going to give me opportunity to build and grow new skills so that I can actually build a career. And that's not what's being offered, at least right now, for the foreseeable future there.
Yeah, and as you made that decision, did you end up reaching out to your parents, given that they'd spent their entire careers as public land stewards and been federal employees?
I did. Yeah, I talked to them quite a lot. And they were just as kind of shocked and disbelieving as I was that all this was happening. I think they had a harder time, have had a harder time wrapping their heads around it than even I have, because they have had their whole lived experience of full career in public lands agencies. And that really worked out for them. It worked out for them great. It worked out for me great that they had those careers. But this, such a sudden shift, I think they had a hard time, like, really wrapping their heads around. No, the work environment in those agencies has radically changed. And it's not a place that I can, at least at this moment in my career, can really afford to stay there and expect to build and grow.
Andrew, listening to this, it makes me think about this memory I have from being a kid.
Oh, yeah? Do tell.
I know this is going to sound like a tangent, but like my uncle, he was, or still is, really into model train sets. I mean, like, we're talking like over-the-top model train sets that can fill up like a basement.
You mean the large sheet of plywood on the sawhorses that takes up like an entire room, like the crazy model ones?
Yeah. And so when I was a kid, he gave me this electric train set, and I loved it. Like, it had like smoke. There was like little liquid that you would put in the engine, and smoke would come out of the smokestack on the engine. And there was this power box. It was red, and I can like still feel it in my hands. It had this black dial that you would twist that would increase power, but you had to back off the power when you were going around a bend, or you'd like flip the train over. And it was magic to me. And I wanted to understand how this magic worked. And so I took it apart, and I was so certain that I knew what I was doing, or that I knew best about how I might put it all back together. And I remember there was just like, it felt almost irrational, like I needed to do it. And I started tearing it apart. And even as I was doing it, there was this voice in my head sort of saying, is this a good idea? And I kept going. I'm like just ripping this thing apart. And pretty soon this magic thing, this wonderful, complicated system, was all in pieces around me. And that part of me with the reckless curiosity like woke up, and I was left there looking at all the parts and all the bits that were no longer connected, all the gears and wheels. And I realized I had no freaking clue what I was doing. And I remember this shiver of sadness, of like disappointment. Not just because my train was like irreparably harmed, but because I was the one that perpetrated it, and that I was so irrationally confident that it bordered on not really caring what was at stake.
I get the sense this is a not so subtle parable about people like Elon Musk and his cohort.
No, you can read into it, but I think like when I listen to this story, it just reminds me of being in that room, of something being in pieces, taken apart by a child who never took the time to figure out how the pieces might come back together. Except the pieces are people's lives, their livelihoods, their hopes, their families that are provided for, and their institutions. And I'm not saying that the Bureau of Land Management was as cool or as perfect as my train, but there is a reason why they're there. It's an incredibly complicated job that's happening out there.
So then to me, the biggest question is, were you ever able to put the train back together again?
No, I tried, but it never worked again. And I didn't tell my parents. I just put it back together enough so that it looked like a train, and I put it up on the shelf, and it didn't work, and it just sat there. But my parents never realized that it was broken.
I asked Sam what he thinks the administration's larger goals are with these actions.
I think their largest goal is extraction. I think they want to make more use of public lands in this kind of traditional resource extraction sense, right? Like right after all of this terminations and reinstatements and deferred resignations, right after all of that happened, Trump signed another executive order directing the Forest Service to increase their lumber output by 25% in the next few years, which is huge. That is a huge feat for the whole Forest Service to pivot towards while they're bleeding employees left and right. I think their goal is to make government not function so that people think that we have to turn to private individuals and corporations to manage a lot of the public good that we have so far let the government deal with. I would say it's certainly not surprising to me, and like a lot of what is happening, not just in public lands, but in all sorts of policy places in the federal government right now, I think it is laying bare, no, this is who we are, and this is who we've always been, and we need to face that and address that more fully. I mean, from the outset, the purpose of public lands was really to preserve the vast natural resources of our country, and was certainly geared towards extraction. And because we are and have been in this capitalistic society for so long, it's pretty much always pointed at some kind of extraction. That's the way America has decided to think about public lands, is that they are there for some kind of use. Sometimes that use is timber or minerals or water. Sometimes that use is play and recreation, but it's always for us. It's for human use and consumption. For better or worse, that is what public lands are all about. Coming at public lands from the perspective of this is a place to be used, and that we as American citizens should get something out of this. There's a selfishness to it that I think a lot of the talk around preservation, nature for its own sake, I think doesn't quite acknowledge the larger system that public lands in America exist in, which is that we are consumers. We have to consume the land in some way. I think it's myopic to view land and resources in that way. I think that perspective leaves a lot out that deserves more thought about how we relate to our environment and to places. And so it makes me feel, sad that we as a culture don't turn to our public lands and think of them more as partners or as part of our community, and instead they're something for us to dominate and subjugate and get something out of.
In the meantime, people like Jen at the Washington Trails Association are left scrambling in the wreckage.
There's still a lot of unknown in terms of what's going to be happening with the future of our work on federal lands. We're going to continue to commit to doing what we can to get out there and to continue to support the Forest Service. But it is a real question of how much partners are going to be asked to do, how much partners can absorb of the lack of resources that the Forest Service has. So is the pivot going to be more towards looking at Washington Trails Association and other nonprofits to help get that work done in ways that we haven't been asked to do before? And so if federal funding continues to diminish, that isn't going to help that cause. We can't get out without the additional funding to help support our work. And so we are kind of taking that as it comes, and every day seems to be a new challenge that we're looking at and learning about to think about our work in the future. I will say in the interim, we are looking at continuing to pivot more towards local and state resources where funding may be a little bit more stable, like the city parks, like the state parks. Of course, the Washington state budget is also not in a good place when looking to recreation and the future of that for the next couple of years. And so really kind of continuing to make ourselves flexible and able to ebb and flow with where those resources might be available. That being said, we will continue to stay in communication on many different levels with the Forest Service. And so as we are learning about the impacts to the federal landscape, we were able to translate that into our advocacy program and looking at ways of generating momentum from our community to help speak up and support trails and support funding to recreation. And so mobilizing our community around what's happening at the federal level is absolutely something we will continue to do.
As Sam talked about walking away from his job, I asked him about this dissonance I had been feeling in our conversation. It felt like there was this contrast between his realism about the bigger picture and what's happening at the federal level, but then his optimism, or if not optimism, at least appreciation about the small picture, about the people sticking it out on the ground, the individuals he worked with, their desire to help and protect public lands.
My opinion on the people, on like the work that happens on the ground in these district offices and on these forests has not really changed. That everyone who comes to work for these federal land management agencies, they come to work there, like, yes, for the stability of the government job, like I've been saying, but they come there mostly because they want to be helping. They want to be helping people. They want to be helping the environment. Everyone genuinely wants to be there and wants to be improving our forests for future generations. I think that my experience working for the Park Service and for the Forest Service and the people that I've always worked with, they are people who really are passionate and committed to managing and safeguarding public lands. And all of them have like very deep connections and roots to protecting these kinds of places. That's the option that people like me who want to work outside and work in conservation, that's kind of the biggest option that there is. And it was for a long time the best option, is to work for the government in those capacities. There are lots of nonprofits that do really incredible conservation work in a lot of different areas, but like the government is the biggest and the most stable one doing any kind of that work. So even if I think that the ideological perspective that our system of government has towards protecting public lands has its flaws, I still want to be engaged in that kind of work. And I think a lot of other people do too. You would be hard pressed to find a public lands employee who is not displeased with the way that we manage public lands. There are lots and lots of flaws and holes and red tape and hurdles, and it can be very frustrating work, but people stick it out for decades. They stick it out for their whole career because they also believe that it's important to get that work done. So my opinion of that kind of work happening and the people doing it has not changed at all. My opinion of kind of how our larger culture or society maybe thinks about public lands, it has changed. It's easy, I think, for me as a person who's worked in these places for a long time and who's been, in like a very kind of insular outdoor communities for a long time. It's easy for me to be in that bubble and think that everybody loves public lands and people just come here to play and enjoy it. And that's a great thing. But seeing these shifts at a higher level is helping me kind of take a bigger step back and realize like, well, what's actually true is that large chunks of our society and culture don't really think about our public lands like that much, and certainly not in the like kind of all-encompassing way that I have for a long time. That it's a very small piece of the puzzle connected to how they feel about healthcare or taxes or any number of like government actions. One thing that I'm excited about transitioning away from working in that line, of being outside so much, is being able to touch back on kind of my own desire to independently go and do that on my own for my own self, not because it's my work, but because it's something that I love and something that brings me a lot of peace and joy. I would love to still work in the realm of conservation and protecting the environment, but using, these skills that I have now and could continue to refine and build on. Like I would love to work for some advocacy organization and put my brain more into that work, whereas I have been putting a lot of my body into that kind of work in the past.
So, Andrew, what happens like when we zoom out? How many Sams are out there?
So Sam says that in his personal lived experience working at the Darrington district, he estimates about a quarter of his employees or coworkers took the buyout. On a bigger picture level, the exact numbers, though, are more difficult to ascertain. Politico has a story in which they reported that in the USDA, which is the big agency that houses the Forest Service, that between the fork in the road email and then the second email, about 15,000 employees have taken the off-ramp. And by early April, 4,000 Forest Service employees had taken the deferred resignation, which is about 11.4% of the workforce. So between Sam's estimate of 25% and this Politico story of 11%, it still constitutes thousands and thousands of people who were previously protecting public lands who now aren't. And here's the kicker, and I mean, it almost goes without saying, but with all of those thousands of people walking away, the institutions are straining at their ability to even function normally. Like, for instance, if you take wildland firefighting, there's a wildfire season, and frequently those employees will get shifted away from their day-to-day jobs to assist in wildland firefighting. They're not the actual people fighting the fires, but maybe they're the support and they're helping with logistics. That can't happen anymore because those people don't exist, or it can't happen at the same level. And the irony of this is that by May, when wildfire season was starting, higher-ups were asking people who had taken the fork in the road and taken the buyout to return back to their jobs. Perhaps in a future world, Sam might end up at a place like WTA, a local nonprofit doing the hard work with limited budgets and limited peoples. They do not, probably will not, have the resources, the heft, or the magnitude of a government agency, but they'll keep trying to do the best work they can.
We don't yet know what the long-term impacts are going to be. We are starting to see signs of what that will look like, but at the core of it, this reduction in force that's happening at the federal level is permanent, and those positions that we are losing are not slated to come back. And so this is going to be the reality for the foreseeable future, with more reductions to come. So I think just bracing for these impacts to be apparent this summer and potentially into the coming years as well too. And so adapting how we recreate on the landscape is going to continue to need to be a priority based on what we're seeing the impacts are to the environment and resources out there.
As Sam and I wrapped up, I asked him why he had agreed to do this interview and if there was anything he hoped to get out of it.
I mean, I think it's important for people to hear from employees on the ground who have been riding this roller coaster of the last few months with the administration. I think that is very important to hear some human element of the story about our public lands, the people who work for them. I also wanted to do this because there's not a lot of room inside of the positions that I've had, like the kind of lower on the totem pole positions that I've had working for the government, because there is a huge culture of fear, probably everywhere in the federal government right now, but for sure in the Forest Service, that's very real and very palpable. And that's another big reason I decided to step away, and a big reason why I think it's important to talk about it is because I am in a position where it serves me more to talk about it than it does to not talk about it.
I want to take a moment to thank a few people. This was a tricky story to report on, in part because there was a lot of confusion early on about what was happening during the firing of the federal workers. Not only about what was going on, but who could talk to the media. We are grateful to Sam for sharing his story, as it offered a unique insight into what has happened over the last 4 months. A special shout out to Casey, who approached us with the story idea and helped connect us with federal workers who had just been fired. And a big thanks to the federal workers who spoke to us on background. People connected us with other people, and hearing your stories, it helped us, even if we couldn't broadcast them. And thanks to the union reps who were helping all those employees figure out if and when they could talk to folks like us. Thanks to Jen at Washington Trails Association for helping out with the story. If you're interested in helping fill in some of the gaps that have been created by this reduction in force, reach out. Whether it's at state, county, or city level, there's likely a group working on trails near you. And remember, if you're out on the trails this summer, help out and make sure that you're packing out what you pack in. And maybe even pack out what other people failed to. And thanks to all the folks who opted in and joined Diaries Plus. Their support makes in-depth reporting like today's episode possible. Seriously, out there, you make this happen. If you believe that stories like this are important, please consider joining. Check the link in the show notes. Sign up, support the show. Let's do this together. If you have a compelling idea for a guest or story lead, please give us a shout. You can email us at editor@ducktapethenbeer.com. Music today from Drexler, Daniel M. Peterson, Sigurd Jonk Jensen, Tahif Atiek, Novemrika, Sinyon, and Gili Ju. The tracks are courtesy of the Artists or Track Club. Jacob Bain and Nice Koto composed our theme song. You can find the artists at our website, dirtbagdiaries.com. This episode was produced by Andrew Burton with additional production help from Becca Cahal, illustration by Walker Cahal. Becca Cahal is our executive producer. I'm Fitz Cahal, and you've been listening to the Dirtbag Diaries. Thanks for tuning in.